Hey, crazy Quellwood kids. Hope you're having a good Sunday today. It's me, Mr. Olinger, again. We're here to read another 2 chapters of Holes. One's really short, so we're going to go ahead and read 2 today. And before I do that, I got a quick trivia quiz to see if you can remember. What are the dimensions of the holes that the kids are digging? What are the dimensions? See if you guys can remember that. And we'll talk about that at the end. So really quickly, just an update from yesterday. Kissing Kate Barlow was out on the lake, the dry lake bed, with Trout and Linda, and they were trying to get out of her where the stash was. And just at the end, a giant lizard had jumped toward her. And Linda tried to swat it with the shovel, and then Trout shot at it with the gun, and they both missed, and it bit Kate on the ankle. They said, "Where is it? Where is it?" And they said, "Where did you bury it?" And she said, "Start digging," and died laughing. So that was pretty cool. And it sounds like they may have been digging ever since then. So now we're starting on part 2, the last hole. So part 2, the last hole, chapter 29. There was a change in the weather for the worse. The air became unbearably humid. Stanley was drenched in sweat. Beads of moisture ran down the handle of his shovel. It was almost as if the temperatures had gotten so hot that the air itself was sweating. A loud boom of thunder echoed across the lake. The storm was way off to the west, beyond the mountains. Stanley could count more than 30 seconds between the flashes of lightning and the boom of the thunder. That's how far away the storm was. Sound travels a great distance across barren wastelands. Usually Stanley couldn't see the mountains at this time of the day. The only time they were ever visible was just at sunup, before the air became thick and hazy. Now, however, the sky was very dark off to the west, and every time the lightning flashed, the dark shape of the mountains would appear briefly. "Come on, rain," shouted Armpit. "Blow this way. Maybe it'll rain hard and we could fill up this whole lake," said Squid. "We can go swimming." 40 days and 40 nights, said X-Ray. "Guess we better start building an ark. Get 2 of each animal, right?" "Right," said Zigzag. 2 rattlesnakes, 2 scorpions, and 2 yellow-spotted lizards. The humidity, or maybe the electricity in the air, had made Zigzag's head even more wild-looking. His frizzy blonde hair stuck out almost straight. The horizon lit up with a huge web of lightning. In that split second, Stanley thought he saw an unusual rock formation on top of one of the mountain's peaks. The peak looked exactly like a giant fist, but it had a thumb sticking straight up. Then it was gone, and Stanley wasn't sure whether he had seen it or not. "I found refuge on God's thumb." That was what his great-grandfather had supposedly said after Kate Barlow had robbed him and left him stranded out in the desert. No one had ever knew what he meant by that. He was delirious when he had used it. But how could he live for 3 weeks without food or water? Stanley had asked his father. "I don't know. I wasn't there," replied his father. "I wasn't even born yet. My father wasn't born yet. My grandmother, your great-grandmother, was a nurse in the hospital where they treated him. He'd always talked about how she'd dab his forehead with a cool, wet cloth, and she said he fell in love with her. He thought she was an angel." A real angel? His father didn't know. What about after he got better? Did he ever say what he meant by God's thumb or how he survived? No, he just blamed his no-good pig-stealing father. The storm moved off further west, along with any hope of rain, but the image of the fist and the thumb remained in Stanley's head. Although instead of lightning flashing beyond the thumb, in Stanley's mind, the lightning was coming out of the thumb, as if it was God's thumb. Right, chapter 30. The next day was Zigzag's birthday, or so he said. Zigzag lay in his cot almost as everyone else headed outside. I get to sleep in because it's my birthday. Then, a little while later, he came into the breakfast line, just in front of Squid. Squid told him to go to the end of the line. "Hey, it's my birthday," Zigzag said. Stay where he was. "It's not your birthday," said Magnet, who was standing behind Squid. "Is too," said Zigzag. "July 8th. Stanley was behind Magnet. He didn't know what day of the week it was, let alone the date of it. It could have been July 8th, but how would Zigzag know? He tried to figure out, as long as he'd been at Camp Green Lake, if indeed it was July 8th. "I came here May 24th, he said aloud. "So that means I've been here 46 days, said Zero. Stanley was still trying to remember how many days there were in May and June. He looked at Zero. He learned not to doubt when it came to math. 46 days. It felt more like 1,000. He didn't dig a hole that first day. He hadn't dug one yet today. That meant he dug 44 holes, if it really was July the 8th. "I can't have an extra carton of juice," Zigzag asked Mr. Sir. "It's my birthday." To everyone's surprise, Mr. Sir gave it to him. Stanley dug his shovel into the dirt. "Hole number 45. The 45th hole is the hardest," he said to himself. But that really wasn't true, and he knew it. He was a lot stronger than he first arrived. His body had adjusted somewhat to the heat and the harsh conditions. Mr. Sir was no longer depriving him of water. After having to get on by less water for a week or so, Stanley felt now like he had all the water he could want. Of course, it helped that Zero did some of his hole for him each day, but that wasn't as great as everyone thought it was. He always felt awkward as Zero was digging his hole, unsure of what to do with himself. Usually he stood around a while before sitting off by himself on the hard ground with the sun beating down on him. It was better than digging, but not a lot better. When the sun came up a couple of hours later, Stanley looked for the thumb of God. The mountains were little more than dark shadows off into the horizon. He thought he could make out a spot where the top of one of the mountains seemed to jet upward, but it didn't seem very impressive. A short time later, the mountains were no longer visible, hidden beyond the glare of the sun reflecting off the dirty air. It was possible, he realized, that he was somehow near where Kate Barlow had robbed his great-grandfather. If that was really her lipstick tube he'd found, then she must have lived somewhere around here. Zero took his turn before the lunch break. Stanley climbed out of his hole and Zero climbed down onto it. "Hey, caveman," said Zigzag, "you should get a whip. Then your slave doesn't dig fast enough, you can crack it across his back." "He's not my slave," said Stanley. "We have a deal, that's all." "A good deal for you," said Zigzag. "It was Zero's idea, not mine." "Don't you know, Zig?" said X-Ray, coming over. "Caveman's doing Zero a big favor. Zero likes to dig holes." "He sure is a nice guy to let Zero dig his holes for him," said Squid. "Well, what about me?" asked Armpit. "I like to dig holes, too. Can I dig one for you, caveman, after Zero's finished?" The other boys laughed. "No, I want to," said Zigzag. "It's my birthday." Stanley tried his best to ignore them. Zigzag kept at it. "Come on, caveman. Be a pal. Let me dig your hole." Stanley smiled as if it were a big joke. When Mr. Pendanski arrived with the water and lunch, Zigzag offered Stanley a place in line. "Since you're so much better than me," Stanley remained where he was. "I didn't say I was bet." "You're insulting him, Zig," said X-Ray. "Why should Caveman take your place when he deserves to be at the very front? He's better than all of us, aren't you, Caveman?" "No," said Stanley. "Sure you are," said X-Ray. "Now come to the front of the line where you belong." "That's okay," said Stanley. "No, it's not okay," said X-Ray. "Get up here." Stanley hesitated, then moved to the front of the line. "Well, this is a first," Mr. Pendanski said, coming around the side of the truck. He filled Stanley's canteen and handed it back a sack lunch. Stanley was glad to get away. He sat down between his hole and Zero's. He was glad that he'd be digging his own hole for the rest of the day. Maybe the other boys would leave him alone. Maybe he shouldn't let Zero dig his hole for him anymore, but he nodded to save his energy to be a good teacher. He bit into his sandwich, which contained some kind of meat and cheese mixture that came in a can. Just about everything at Green Lake came in a can. The supply truck came once a month. He glanced up to see Zigzag and Squid walking toward him. "I'll give you my cookie if you let me dig your hole," said Zigzag. Squid laughed. "Here, take my cookie," said Zigzag, holding it out for him. "No thanks," said Stanley. "Come on, take my cookie," said Zigzag, sticking it in his face. "Leave me alone," said Stanley. "Please eat my cookie," said Zigzag, holding it under Stanley's nose. Squid laughed. Stanley pushed it away. Zigzag pushed him back. "Don't push me." "I didn't." Stanley got to his feet. He looked around. Mr. Pendanski was filling Zero's canteen. Zigzag pushed him again. "I said, don't push me." Stanley took a step backwards, carefully avoiding Zero's hole. Zigzag kept after him. He shoved Stanley and said, "Quit pushing." "Lay off," said Armpit, as he and Magnet and X-Ray joined them. "Why should he?" snapped X-Ray. "Caveman's bigger. Can't he take care of himself?" "I don't want any trouble," Stanley said. Zigzag pushed him hard. "Eat my cookie," he said. Stanley was glad to see Mr. Pendanski coming toward them along with Zero. "Hi, Mom," said Armpit. "We were just fooling around." "I saw what was going on," said Mr. Pendanski. He turned to Stanley. "Go ahead, Stanley," he said. "Hit him back. You're bigger." Stanley stared at Mr. Pendanski in astonishment. "Teach the bully a lesson," said Mr. Pendanski. Zigzag hit Stanley on the shoulder with his open hand. "Teach me a lesson," he challenged. Stanley made a feeble attempt to punch Zigzag. Then he felt a flurry of fists against his head and neck. Zigzag had a hold of his collar with one hand and was hitting him with the other. The collar ripped and Stanley fell backwards onto the dirt. "That's enough," Mr. Pendanski yelled. It wasn't enough for Zigzag. He jumped on top of Stanley. "Stop!" shouted Mr. Pendanski. The side of Stanley's face was pressed against the dirt. He tried to protect himself, but Zigzag's fist slammed into his arms and punched his face into the ground. All of a sudden, all he could do was wait for it to be over. Then, suddenly, Zigzag was off of him. Stanley managed to look up and saw that Zero had his arm around Zigzag's long neck. Zigzag made a gurgling sound, and he desperately tried to pry Zero's arm from off of him. "You're going to kill him!" shouted Mr. Pendanski. Zero kept squeezing. Armpit charged into them, freeing Zigzag from Zero's chokehold. The three boys fell to the ground in different directions. Mr. Pendanski fired his pistol into the air. The other counselors came running from the office. The tents are out of the lake. They had their guns drawn, but holstered them when they saw that the trouble was over. The warden walked over from her cabin. "There was a riot," Mr. Pendanski told her. "Zero almost strangled Ricky." The warden looked at Zigzag, who was still stretching and massaging his neck. She then turned her attention to Stanley, who was obviously in the worst condition. "What happened to you?" "Nothing. It wasn't a riot." Ziggy was beating up the caveman, said Armpit. Then Zero started choking Zigzag, and I had to pull Zero off Zigzag. It was all over before Mom fired off his pistol. They just got a little hot, that's all, said X-Ray. You know how it is. In the sun all day, people get hot, right? But everybody's cool now. I see, the warden said. She turned to Zigzag. What's the matter? Didn't you get a puppy for your birthday? Zig's just a little hot, said X-Ray. Out in the sun all day, you know how it is. The blood starts to boil. Is that what happened, Zigzag? Asked the warden. Yeah, said Zigzag. Like X-Ray said, working so hard in the hot sun while Caveman just sits around doing nothing, my blood boils. Excuse me? Said the warden. Caveman digs his holes just like everyone else. Zigzag shrugged. Sometimes. Excuse me? Zero's been digging part of Caveman's hole every day, said Squid. The warden looked from Squid to Stanley to Zero. I'm teaching him to read and write, said Stanley. It's sort of a trade. The hole gets dug, so what does it matter who digs it? Excuse me, said the warden. Isn't it more important for him to learn to read? Stanley asked. Doesn't that build character more than digging holes? That's his character, said the warden. What about your character? Stanley raised and lowered his shoulders. The warden turned to Zero. Well, Zero, what have you learned so far? Zero said nothing. Have you just been digging Caveman's holes for nothing? The warden asked him. He likes to dig holes, said Mr. Pendanski. Tell me what you learned yesterday, said the warden. Stanley, can you remember that? Zero said nothing. Mr. Pendanski laughed. He picked up a shovel and said, You might as well try to teach this shovel to read. It's got more brains than Zero. The at sound, said Zero. The at sound? Repeated the warden. Well then, tell me, what does C-A-T spell? Zero glanced around uneasily. Stanley knew the answer. Zero just didn't like answering questions. Cat, Zero said. Mr. Pendanski clapped his hands. Bravo! Bravo! The boy's a genius. F-A-T, said the warden. Zero thought a moment. Stanley hadn't taught him the F sound yet. F, Zero whispered. F, at. Fat. How about H-A-T, asked the warden. Stanley hadn't taught him the H sound either. Zero concentrated hard and then said, Chat. All the counselors laughed. He's a genius, all right, said Mr. Pendanski. He's so stupid, he doesn't even know he's stupid. Stanley didn't know why Mr. Pendanski seemed to have it in for Zero. If Mr. Pendanski only thought about it, he realized it was very logical for Zero to think that the letter H made the CH sound. Okay, from now on, I don't want anyone digging anyone else's holes, said the warden. And no more reading lessons. I'm not digging another hole, said Zero. Good, said the warden. She turned to Stanley. You know why you're digging holes? Because it's good for you. It teaches you a lesson. If Zero digs your hole for you, then you're not learning your lesson, are you? I guess not, Stanley mumbled, although he knew they weren't digging just to learn a lesson. She was looking for something that belonged to Kissin' Kate Barlow. Why can't I dig my hole but still teach Zero to read? He asked. What's wrong with that? I tell you what's wrong with that, the warden said. It leads to trouble. Zero almost killed Zigzag. It causes him stress, Mr. Pendanski said. I know you mean well, Stanley, but let's face it. Zero's too stupid to learn to read. It's what makes his blood boil, not the hot sun. I'm not digging another hole, Zero said. Mr. Pendanski handed him the shovel. Here, take it, Zero. It's all you're ever gonna be good at. Zero took the shovel. Then he swung it like a baseball bat. The metal blades smashed across Mr. Pendanski's face. His knees crumpled beneath him. He was unconscious before he hit the ground. The counselors all drew their guns. Zero held the shovel out in front of him as if he was going to try to bat away the bullets. "I hate digging holes," he said. Then he slowly backed away. "Don't shoot him," said the warden. "He can't go anywhere. The last thing we need is an investigation." Zero kept backing up, out past the cluster of holes the boys had been digging, then further and further out into the lake. "He's gonna have to come back for water," the warden said. Stanley noticed Zero's canteen lying on the ground next to his hole. A couple of the counselors helped Mr. Pendanski to his feet and into the truck. Stanley looked out towards Zero, but he had disappeared into the haze. The warden ordered the counselors to take turns guarding the shower room and the rec room all day and all night. They were not to let Zero drink any water. When he returned, he's to be brought directly to her. She examined her fingernails and said, "It's almost time for me to paint my nails again." Before she left, she told the 6 remaining members of Group D that she still expected 7 holes. I wonder what she's painting her fingernails for. Maybe for Zero when he gets back? I don't know. So back to our trivia question. If you guys think you can remember what were the dimensions of the holes that the boys are digging. And we know it's a shovel length deep and a shovel across, and it was 5 feet by 5 feet. So hopefully you remember that. Can't wait to see what's coming up next. It's getting good. Don't miss out. Hope you guys have a good week next week, and get ready for Easter. We'll see you soon.